Hello and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars Rivals. And for those who are new to this series, well, first of all, I would recommend checking out a previous episode where we pitted this XKR up against its predecessor, my one, with the 4.2 litre engine. This time though, as I teased before, I'm doing a showdown of a different type, one that doesn't necessarily seem as obvious on the surface of things. Why on earth would you put a GT, or a sports car in a general sense, up against an executive super saloon? Well, we're going to get to the reasons why, because I actually believe there both can and, crucially, should be a lot more crossover between these two cars in terms of who should be looking at buying one. Now, incidentally, if you want to check out longer reviews for either of these cars, I have of course done independent reviews for each of them here on the channel as well, so you can check out either of those down in the video description. And incidentally, tell me down in the comments, or just have a think to yourself, which of these two cars you prefer at the start of the video, and then see after the video's end which one you then prefer. Is it the same? Have you maybe reconsidered or come around to a newer point of view? So of course, let me know down below. See, I purchased an XKR, but an XFR was strongly in the running for me. And we're going to get, of course, into some of the reasons in this video, because this is much more than just two cars that share the same engine, because for those who don't know, that they do. Both of these vehicles have a 5 litre supercharged V8, of course front mounted in both cases, rear wheel drive. Of course the power and torque is the same as well, 503 horsepower, 461 pound-feet, which incidentally is 625 newton meters for those who are curious. So surely if these cars have the same heart and soul, and the exact same spec, well, isn't one just the same thing with 2 doors and one's got 4 doors? How different could they really feel? Well, actually no, they feel very different, shockingly different in fact, to the point where even though both of these cars could satisfy the same person, which one you ultimately choose could actually really divide the potential group of buyers. Now, for those of you who are existing XKR fans on the channel, and I know there are quite a few of you, many of you came from that XKR Showdown video, and some of you have come from my reviews of XKs, maybe even my video announcing that I purchased one, and I would wager that the majority of those of you who are XK fans probably haven't driven an XFR. Because after all, there's not a huge amount of crossover. Why would you have driven one? Now, some of you might have, and I'm going to assume that those of you who have will know why I'm doing this video, because there's a lot of merit in that 4-door car, so let's get into the performance in an even deeper way to find if there are any differences. Now, in terms of weight, both of these cars are fairly up there, about 1700 kilos on the coupe, about 1800 or so in the sedan, so not a colossal difference. They're both actually really good for what they are. In terms of performance though, they do set themselves apart. Now again, some people claim they get better numbers than this, but let's just go with the quote-unquote official 0 to 60, which is 4.6 seconds on the XKR and 4.7 seconds on the XFR. That's pretty close between the two cars. Under 5 seconds is the general consensus, and the top speed on both is of course limited to 155. The reality is you can get over 170 out of the XKR, and we could safely assume the same applies to the XF. In fact, Jaguar themselves of course modified one, a number of aero additions etc, and took it to 227 miles an hour in the case of the 4-door car. So top end performance is not lacking on either of these machines, that's for sure. In terms of handling, that is a little bit more subjective. I can't quote numbers to you when it comes to how the car feels through corners, so of course a lot of this is going to be my opinion on how these two felt, and that opinion will definitely differ from person to person. A lot of people though have, and I believe this is an issue, wherein they kind of close their mind to this part of the discussion. They more or less assume, well, surely the XKR feels better. How could it not feel better? It's wider, lower, has a lower center of gravity, it's more sleek, it weighs less in fact, and it has all of the same power and torque. So how could it not be better? Well, that's an interesting discussion to have, because it depends on your definition of better. If your primary concern is to get from point A to point B through corners and down straight sections as rapidly as possible, then yes, I would agree with you, the XKR, chances are, will win. 9 times out of 10 in fact. However, I would actually say that in my experience of driving multiple XKRs and of course the XFR here, I actually find the XFR more fun through corners, and I think part of the reason why is actually because it's not as good. And what I mean by that is, it is longer, taller, heavier, maybe not quite as focused, but that kind of makes it more engaging. It feels almost like a pure muscle car to the much more kind of focused and refined GT that the XKR is. The XKR is legitimately one of the best GT cars around for a combination of comfort and performance. It's not huge and obese like a Bentley Continental, as great as that car is, and it's not some super light rattle your teeth out Italian. It's a great mix. The XF though is so different. It's bigger, rounder, softer, and it feels, to me at least, more old school. It feels almost like the modern interpretation of a 60s or 70s four-door muscle car. And as many of you who know my taste in cars will know, well, 10 times out of 10, the car that is just faster doesn't tend to impress me more. I would much rather drive a car that feels more engaging even if it is slower. So in terms of handling, I actually favour the XFR of these two. In fact, by a huge margin. I find it far more fun through corners. In terms of comfort as well, and this is not too much of a surprise, I would say that the XF is the more comfortable of the two in terms of its suspension, in terms of its overall ride quality, and being an executive saloon, you would kind of hope so. That's not really surprising, but for those who are wondering, I can confirm that that is the case. One of the curious differences between these cars though comes in terms of practicality. See, you'd assume that the biggest single advantage that the XFR has is probably the extra doors and seats and maybe even trunk space. Well, you're kind of correct there, and we're going to talk about that more in a moment, but one of the ironic things is it's actually less practical for fuel economy. See, with the same engine, you'd assume that surely they'd be fairly similar. Maybe even the XFR could be better because of its aerodynamics. Sometimes a longer, more rounded car will have a more advanced aero. Not the case here. And part of the reason is because for some weird reason, Jaguar opted to put a smaller fuel tank in the four-door, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me, but hey, there you go. In the XKR, it's about 70.6 litre, some places say 71, to the 64 litre tank in the XFR. That's a pretty massive difference. That's 15.6 gallons to 14 gallons. A whole 1.6 gallons is a pretty big difference to fuel range, especially when, according to the averaged out economies that most owners get, the XK is actually more economical, which is kind of crazy to me. It can do about 22 to the gallon overall. Some will get more, some will get less, and of course it depends where you're driving it a lot of the time as well, be it city or highway. But 22 is the overall online average. In the XF, it's 20.6. That's not as good, and because of the fact that the tank is smaller, well, in the XKR, you can comfortably get up around 340, 350 miles out of it, whereas the XF, you can get about 300 on a longer run if you're on the highway. So that's actually a pretty bad knock against the four-door car in terms of practicality, which is pretty ironic. You probably weren't expecting that. However, we can't talk about practicality without talking about literal physical practicality, because of course the extra two doors, the extra seat, technically being a 5-seater instead of the 4, and of course the extra rear legroom, which is a pretty massive difference between these two cars, does mean that that is a huge advantage in favour of the XF. Now here is where a lot of people will say, I don't really care about that. You know, I don't have kids maybe, I don't need the extra practicality. Well then by all means go for the XKR. I technically don't need the practicality most of the time, but when I do have more space, such as with one of my previous cars, the V10 Touareg, well, even though strictly speaking I don't need all of that, I do find myself using the space that I have more often than you'd think. So when you do have extra space, at least you have the option of using it. Again, that won't matter to everyone, but it is something to bear in mind if you're looking to buy a car, depending on how much you plan to do with it. If it's just going to be a sports car, maybe even a daily driver sports car, but something which you never need to take passengers in, you never need to lug anything around much, then of course go for the XK. If you do need to take some extra mates out, or if you need to, lug some stuff in the back that doesn't just want to go in the boot, then the XF might be the car for you. Now, to stray away from practicality for just a second, back to the world of more subjective stuff, let's talk about the sound. Because again, this is one of those weird scenarios where you'd think, well, if they have the same engine, they're both Jags, they're both from the same kind of time period. The XK was 2009 to 2014 in this form, which is similar in the four-door. The XF was 2009 to 2015, and of course it had a facelift in there as well. Incidentally, this is the pre-facelift car. I actually prefer the pre-facelift, to be honest. Funnily enough, I prefer both of these cars in their pre-facelift form. Of course, this XFR and the older 4.2 XK. But in terms of sound, they actually are more different than you'd think, and chances are you heard that from the start of the video. In fact, the XK almost kind of pops and bangs a little bit more, whereas the XF has a surprisingly much deeper rumble to it, even with a completely stock exhaust, as these two have. And even though the sound might not completely come through in the video, I will say without question, for me personally, the XFR sounds infinitely better than the XK, and I'm sure XK owners will reel back in shock at that statement, but again, trust me and drive an XFR before you pass judgment, because the sound is incredible. There's something about the design of the exhaust and the way it resonates through the cabin. It's simply louder. You can hear more of it, and that's all there is to it. And to me, I love the sound that the XFR makes, even with these stock pipes. It's one of my favourite car sounds on the road, and I actually like it even more than my 4.2 XK, which I already prefer over the 5 litre. Now, of course, you can't do a rivals match without talking prices. So, of course, this is going to be subject to change, let's say, because of the time that we release the video. In the future, this will be different, of course, but toward the start of 2021, what are the values, and crucially, what should you be expecting to pay? Well, on the extreme ends of things, you can get one of these XKs, the 5 litre, the XKR, of course, specifically, for about 15 grand, or just a fraction under. They can run all the way up to 47,000 though, and that's if you get the absolute end of run, like a dynamic R with the extra body kit, etc., with as little as about 5 to 8,000 miles, so essentially like a brand new car. That's a great price for what it is, but it's a lot more expensive than XFR values are. With the XFR, you're looking at about 10 grand or just over to begin with. You don't see too many of those, and of course those are higher mileage. 6 figures, 100 and whatever thousand, maybe 130 for example, and on the higher end you're looking at about 25 grand, and that's for the end of run facelifted car. So all in all, even though they start with a 5 grand difference, 15 grand compared to 10, where they end up in the higher range is a massive difference. You can quite easily pay double for a mint, almost brand new XKR compared to a super low mileage XFR. Admittedly, it is much more difficult to find a super low mileage XFR for obvious reasons. It tends to be a car that gets used more, but again, that is something to bear in mind. In terms of what prices you should be paying, well, this is where they get much closer, thankfully. I would recommend for an XKR 5 litre to be looking at least in the UK for between 18 and 22,000 pounds. For those kind of prices, you're going to be looking at much more modest miles, maybe 70 or 80,000 at the most, all the way down to like 30,000. And for the XFR, I would recommend looking in the 13 to 20,000 region, which again, really narrows it down that much more. And in that region, you're looking at the same kind of mileage again. Below 100,000 on the lower end, and for a little bit more, about 30, 40,000 miles, maybe 50,000. So that's the kind of range if you want a really good one. Ultimately, I believe that these two cars actually have far more crossover than you might think. So my ultimate verdict actually ties in directly to the reason why the XFR was my car of the year 2020, and yet why I didn't buy one. So what's my final verdict? Well, the reason why it was my car of the year is because I simply think it's an absolutely phenomenal car. And the simplest way I can describe what it's like to drive and potentially even daily own an XFR is succinctly that it really is an XKR with 4 doors. It sounds like a cliche, but that is exactly what it feels like. It doesn't feel big, heavy, bloated, soft, or just like a modified existing 4-door car. It's so much more than that. It's not like that at all. The XK is a pure GT. Of course, it's much more obvious, much more overt, and it's exactly what you'd expect and hope that it would be. In fact, part of the reason why I love the XFR so much is because of that. It is so surprising. It's shockingly enjoyable. I knew it would be fast, I knew it would be powerful, but I didn't expect it to be this comfortable, practical, cozy, incredible sounding, super smooth, velvet performance car, which simultaneously is one of my favourite driving experiences I've ever had, but at the same time a brute of a modern day British muscle car that it is, whereas the XFR is so brutal that it actually makes the XKR feel sometimes a little bit understated for my taste, and that actually transfers back, if you recall, to my comparison of the 4.2 versus the 5 litre. I find the 4.2 to be more playful. This feels the same. The XFR is so hot rod-esque that it makes the GT car feel almost understated in comparison. So, as I said, the single biggest advantage of either car is this. The biggest advantage of the XFR is that it does everything an XKR can do, but it's even more practical. The 2 extra doors, the extra seat, far more rear legroom, more interior space in a general sense, and just that much more daily usability. However, the biggest advantage of the XKR, and this is the reason why I chose to buy one over an XF, is, in my opinion, the look. It looks every bit as good as it is. The XFR, for as good looking as it is in its own way, is simply not the stage stealer that the XKR is. And when I purchased my new car, I wanted something that wasn't just the part, but which looked the part. A stunning looking, scene-stealing, elegant, gorgeous GT. The XKR is all of that. The XFR simply isn't. It's a good-looking, muscular, semi-understated super saloon. And for most people, that probably won't match an XKR. So ultimately, that's the choice that you need to make. If practicality doesn't matter as much to you, if you want something that has all of the performance, which both of them have, but with the additional looks as well and the wow factor, then definitely go for the XK. If you do decide to go for an XK, then I would also recommend checking out that other Rivals match that I did to decide whether the 4.2 or the 5 litre is the better car for you. However, if you do want the extra space, the extra surprise, almost sleeper factor that the XFR has, then I would strongly recommend checking one out. And even if you are a die-hard XK fan, even if you never want to buy the XF, please try to test drive one, because I think it might just shock you. But that's it overall for my thoughts. Of course, as I always like to say, if you've watched this far in the video and you are or were an owner of one or both of these, or maybe if you've driven them both for instance, drop your thoughts down below. Which one do you prefer? Which one did you prefer perhaps at the start of the video compared to now? Has this helped you to reevaluate, possibly look at an alternative? Tell me about it down below, and of course be sure to check out the previous installments and stick around on the channel for more Rivals matches in the future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.